Control, I've found something incredible. It's pulsing with some kind of energy.
Within 2 kilometers, a nuclear detonation creates a total kill zone. Thermal radiation exceeds the sun's surface, vaporizing concrete and steel, followed by ionizing radiation destroying cellular structures. Surviving this is a physical miracle. To endure this twice is a mathematical near impossibility. Anyone who experiences these forces twice and survives occupies a unique place in human history, existing as the ultimate statistical outlier. In 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived the reality of those statistics. He was a 29-year-old naval engineer, exhausted by the demands of war. He had spent 3 grueling months at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Hiroshima, assigned to the technical design of oil tankers through the heat of summer. He was deeply fatigued and weighed down by the separation from his family. His thoughts were constantly with his wife, Hisako, and their infant son, back in Nagasaki. August 6th was supposed to be his departure date. He had completed his work and was preparing to board a train home that afternoon. For Yamaguchi, the end of the trip represented a return to his personal sanctuary, away from the industrial noise and the stress of the shipyards. At 8:15 a.m., Yamaguchi was walking toward the shipyard for a final check of his documents. The hum of an aircraft pulled his gaze upward. High above, the Enola Gay released a single object that began a slow, parachuted descent toward the city center. The detonation was not a sound, but a flash. Yamaguchi later described it as the most intense light he had ever witnessed, a silent bloom of energy that overwhelmed his vision. In a split second of instinct, he dove into a shallow irrigation ditch along the road, pressing his palms over his ears and squeezing his eyes shut. The shockwave arrived a moment later. The wall of compressed air lifted him from the ditch and threw him through the air, eventually slamming him into a nearby potato patch. This immediate reaction, using the earth as a shield and minimizing his physical profile, is what protected him from the lethal pressure wave that killed those standing nearby. He regained consciousness in a landscape of total darkness. The air was thick with gray ash falling like snow, a sight he likened to a blank cinema screen waiting for a film to begin. The blast had ruptured his left eardrum and left his upper body covered in severe burns, yet he managed to stand. The city he knew had been leveled. He had to navigate through a labyrinth of smoldering ruins and heat-warped metal to find even the most basic shelter. The next morning, despite his internal injuries and the signs of radiation sickness, he refused to stay. He began a slow, agonizing crawl toward the train station. His sense of duty to his wife and son provided a singular focus. This mental clarity allowed him to push through the intense physical trauma of his burns and keep moving toward the only escape route left. He arrived at the Hiroshima station to find the tracks miraculously intact. He boarded a train filled with survivors who, like him, were heavily bandaged and in various states of shock. It was a slow, grim journey away from the devastation. As the train put distance between himself and the ruins of the shipyard, Yamaguchi felt the first stirrings of relief. He believed that by leaving the city, he had successfully escaped the reach of the new weapon. He was heading home, assuming the nightmare was over. The bitter irony of his escape was the destination itself. The train was carrying him directly toward the second target on the military's list. He arrived in Nagasaki and was immediately hospitalized, but by the morning of August 9th, he had insisted on reporting to his office to describe what had happened in Hiroshima. At 11:02 a.m., while his superiors listened with disbelief to his account of a single bomb destroying a city, a second flash of white light filled the room. The explosion in Nagasaki shattered his office and inflicted new injuries, yet once again, the building's reinforced structure and his position within it spared his life. Tsutomu Yamaguchi defied the odds of the nuclear age twice in 3 days. He lived a full, long life, becoming a vocal advocate for peace before passing away at 93, the ultimate witness to human endurance. On August 8, 1945, Yamaguchi stepped off a train and back into the city of Nagasaki. He was returning to a landscape defined by its geography, a valley cradled by steep, protective mountains that offered a profound sense of isolation from the war. He arrived as a shadow of himself, his body covered in heavy bandages to hide the severe burns he suffered in Hiroshima. He was so weak and disfigured that the childhood friend who treated him at the hospital didn't even recognize his face. When he finally reached home, his wife Hisako collapsed into tears at the sight of him. He looked like a ghost, but he was alive, and in the relative safety of Nagasaki, they believed the nightmare was finally behind them. Looking at the city's layout, it's easy to see why they felt secure. The dense urban center was physically shielded by the terrain, creating a natural fortress that seemed to guarantee their survival. But the calendar provided a different reality. It was August 8th. The sun was setting on the final day of the world they knew. Yamaguchi had spent days fleeing the impact of a nuclear weapon, only to unknowingly position himself in the path of the only other one in existence. His journey to find a haven had done the opposite. He had walked out of the ruins of one city and directly into the eye of a second atomic storm. On the morning of August 9th, Yamaguchi chose to ignore his exhaustion and his pain. He forced himself to go to work. He was driven by a stubborn sense of duty to Mitsubishi. He believed his supervisors needed a first-hand account of the destruction in Hiroshima, no matter how difficult the journey to the office was. If we trace a path from his home to his desk, we see his decision in a new light. He moved from the outskirts to an office less than 2 miles from the target. Zooming out to a map of Japan reveals the true scale of this coincidence. Within 72 hours, Yamaguchi had positioned himself at ground zero of 2 separate nuclear strikes in 2 different cities. His commitment to his job had become the very mechanism that dragged him back into the blast zone. At 11 a.m., Yamaguchi sat in his supervisor's office. He described the single flash that leveled Hiroshima, but his boss simply wouldn't believe him. The supervisor argued that it was physically impossible. He insisted that no single weapon, regardless of its design, had the power to erase an entire city from the map. As they argued, the B-29 bomber boxcar was already clearing the clouds above Nagasaki, carrying the plutonium bomb known as Fat Man. Yamaguchi opened his mouth to reply, but the air outside the window suddenly ignited. At exactly 11:02 a.m., the sky flashed white. The shockwave tore through the office building, shattering the windows and throwing Yamaguchi to the ground. The blast was so violent it stripped the bandages from his body and scorched his skin for a second time. Looking up at the rising debris, Yamaguchi was struck by a terrifying thought. He believed the mushroom cloud had personally followed him from Hiroshima. The debate over whether such a weapon could exist was ended by the physical reality of the detonation. Yamaguchi's survival was an anomaly, but he didn't stop to process it. He began a desperate trek through the ruins to find his family. He struggled through a city that had been transformed into a flattened wasteland in a matter of seconds. The geography that felt so protective hours earlier was now a landscape of fire and rubble. When he finally reached the site of his home, he found nothing but ruins. The house had been completely leveled, and he assumed his family was lost in the collapse. But his wife and son were alive. They had survived the blast with only minor injuries because they were sheltering in a nearby tunnel. They were only in that tunnel because they went looking for medicine to treat the horrific burns Yamaguchi had brought back from Hiroshima. The injuries he received 3 days earlier had forced his family into the only shelter that could protect them from the second blast. In a final, recursive twist of fate, Hisako and their son survived because of the very burns that nearly killed Yamaguchi in Hiroshima. In the hours and days following the bombings, Tsutomu Yamaguchi navigated a landscape that had been stripped of its features. The cities around him were flattened into debris-strewn wastelands, representing a scale of destruction that defied existing military descriptions. The physical toll on Yamaguchi's body began immediately. His hair fell out in clumps, his burns became aggressively infected, and he suffered from continuous vomiting. He was experiencing the full, harrowing onset of severe acute radiation sickness. While he struggled, tens of thousands of others were succumbing to the same invisible poison. At a cellular level, the radiation was shattering biological structures from the inside out, leaving the majority of victims with no path to recovery. Yet, Yamaguchi's system did something medically unexpected. His body began to fight back against the cellular damage. Slowly, the infections receded, and his wounds started to close. He was healing. This creates a difficult question for how we categorize survivors of such total destruction. We often rely on luck to explain why one person lives while hundreds of thousands do not. But as the scale of the anomaly grows, that label feels increasingly inadequate. When Japan officially surrendered in September 1945, the global conflict ended, but the personal aftermath for the survivors was only beginning. They were left to find their own way through the wreckage of the post-war era. Yamaguchi sought a life defined by utility rather than tragedy. In the 1950s, he found work as a translator for the U.S. Armed Forces, the very military that had deployed the weapons he survived. By the early 1960s, he returned to his engineering roots at Mitsubishi. He focused on his career and raised a family, choosing to bury the details of the bombings beneath the demands of a normal life. For decades, he stayed away from the public eye. He did not seek official status as a Niju Hibakusha, a double survivor, and he refused to be treated as a medical or historical curiosity. This period of silence reflects a common human drive, the attempt to neutralize the weight of a traumatic history by assimilating into the mundane. He wanted to be an engineer and a father, not a witness. But the biological consequences of 1945 were not eradicated, they were merely dormant. After 50 years of silence, the effects of the radiation re-emerged within his family's lineage. The quiet life Yamaguchi had built was shattered when his son died of cancer at the age of 59. Yamaguchi viewed the diagnosis with absolute certainty. He believed his son's death was a direct, delayed casualty of the atomic blasts he had survived decades earlier. This loss pulled the atomic age out of the history books and back into his living room. The radiation was an active force still claiming members of his family, making his continued silence feel like a secondary tragedy. He realized that he could no longer afford to be a quiet anomaly. The death of his son forced him to see his own survival as a platform that he was now obligated to use. In his final years, Yamaguchi began speaking publicly, calling for the total disarmament of global nuclear arsenals. He traded his privacy for a microphone. This mission eventually took him to the United Nations in 2006, at 90 years old. He stood before world leaders to ensure they heard the testimony of a man who had seen the sun fall twice. Yamaguchi arrived at a final philosophical conclusion that his survival was not a random occurrence but a mandated destiny. He told the assembly that because he had experienced the bombings twice, he was the only one who could truly speak to their reality. When he passed away in 2010 at the age of 93, the cause was stomach cancer. It was a final physical echo of the events of 1945, arriving 65 years late. Yamaguchi spent his remaining years converting his survival into a warning for the rest of humanity. In a world that still maintains thousands of warheads, his story serves as a living barrier against the return of the weapons that pursued him for a lifetime.